talked about which movies never lose their watchability for me, I think the results of this are pretty obvious, but I'm going to talk about them anyway because both the original and the remake do have some positives to bring to the table, and the films that I'm going to be comparing today are both versions of Nosferatu, A Symphony of Horror, and Phantom der Nacht. So first off, I'm going to talk about what the original did better. First off, the original has this whole sequence that takes place on a ship where it shows the vampire's journey to this town where he wreaks havoc on the people and spreads his disease. In the original, they actually show some of his journey in getting there, and it showcases some of the creepiest moments in the entire movie. In the remake, it's obvious how he gets there, but they only show like that iconic low angle of the vampire walking across the ship, and that's about it. They don't really go the extra mile to show what the people on the ship are going through or anything. It's like it just arrives at the harbor with all of the crew dead, and then somebody reads from the diary, and it's really not quite as memorable. Secondly, I like the way that they showcase the relationship between the main guy and his wife, and their names are different in both versions. In the original, it's Thomas and Ellen. In the remake, it's Jonathan and Lucy. But, in the original, it does come across that these two are head over heels for each other, and it is kind of silly and over the top, but it was the silent film era, and again, at least they get that point across. In the remake, there's like a moment where they hug it out for a really long time before Jonathan leaves for Transylvania, and that's about it. If there's any spark between these two, it's a pretty damp one. Also, I prefer the way that the vampire's assistant is portrayed in the original film. As they are keeping with the names of the Dracula characters in the remake, in that version he's called Renfield, whereas in the original his name was Knock. And, Knock was also kind of a silly character, but at the same time he was very creepy, and he just looked like an unpleasant person that you would never want to be around. And you could tell that he had a few screws loose. And yeah, it's pretty obvious that he's not all there in the remake, but you can't even take him seriously. He doesn't even look scary, and he is constantly giggling like a fucking idiot, and it is just extremely irritating. I think that one of the main benefits to the original version of this character was that you never heard his voice. And most importantly, I'm sure you already know where this is going by now, but I think they do the vampire a lot better in the original. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't mind Klaus Kinski's performance in the remake. With the material that he was given, he did an awesome job. But, first of all, I just like how it's not as obvious from the beginning that this character is in fact a vampire. Like, he wears a hat to cover the tips of his pointed ears. He doesn't open his mouth too wide so you can't see the fangs. He is creepy to look at, but you're not completely under the impression that he's this blood-sucking monster. And, in the remake, you can see the pointed ears. You can see the pointed teeth up front right away. He's already freakish to look at, and, why Jonathan trusted this guy enough to enter his castle is beyond me. Plus, he has this monologue in the film about, living for centuries and wanting to die but not being able to. And it is a really beautiful monologue. It does add some tragedy to the character, but at the same time, it's almost like Jared Leto's Joker having the damaged tattoo on his forehead. It's a little bit much. Plus, another one of the creepiest scenes in the original is when the vampire is entering the main character's room at night. It's a really nightmarish visual once you see him in full vampire form for the first time. They do a scene like that in the remake, but given the fact that you already see his full appearance from the moment he first appears in the film, it really doesn't have nearly as much impact. Now, I know that it just sounds like I'm completely shitting on the remake at this point, and I'll admit that when I watched it for the first time as a teenager, it was side by side with the original, and I actually hated it at the time. I thought it was really boring, but then I rewatched it as an adult and found that there were a few things to appreciate about it, which I'm going to get into right now, of course. And the first thing for me, I know it's going to sound unfair, but the original does have a score that was written for it, and it's a very good one. It kind of reminds me of the music from Coppola's Dracula film. I get the impression that he may have taken some influence from that, or, at least the composer for it. I don't know why I think Coppola would have taken that himself, but anyway, I do think that the remake has a better soundtrack to it. Just when the film starts and the main titles are rolling, as the camera pans over these dead bodies, the music that's playing just delivers the impression that you're in for this very dark and unpleasant experience. And then when Jonathan goes to visit Dracula's castle in the film, I think that the director utilizes the technology that he has to add sound to his movie to his full advantage, because for the most part there's no music playing during the scenes that take place in the castle. Mostly you just hear the wind blowing and animals howling outside the castle in the night, and it just adds this very heavy atmosphere to the scene. So yeah, the remake definitely wins for soundtrack. And honestly, I think that the remake has a much more effective ending to it. And for those of you who have not seen the remake of Nosferatu, don't worry, I'm not going to give away any of the more radical changes that they made. But I will say that it is much more tragic, and it makes it a much darker film as a whole. In fact, I could kind of see this being like The Mist, where some people might love the ending and some people might hate it. And those who hate it, I would completely understand why. And aside from that, I also prefer the vampire's death scene in the remake. It was very beautifully done in the original, but again, it's a case where I think the visuals were just more effective. Whereas in the original, you just see him shrink back from the sun and then some flames are shrinking into the corner of the screen. In the remake, you actually see him die, like he just shrivels up like an insect being burnt. And the only special effects that they add to him in that scene, aside from the, vampiric makeup effects, are some white contact lenses. The actual effect of him physically shriveling up is all done through Klaus Kinski's acting, so it's a very commendable performance for sure. So in the end, in my opinion, the original is the superior film. It just has a lot more going for it. It's much more entertaining, and it's just one of my all-time favorite vampire movies. But if you're a fan of the original as well and you haven't seen the remake yet, I would recommend checking it out, because once again, there are enough things to like about it to make it worth your time. Anyway, that's all I've got to say about this comparison. I hope y'all have a good one.